I think one of the main things is that when we think about will to fight, I think the important thing to think about when it comes to Chinese gray zone kind of coercion is that it's by and large backfired. You look at the trend lines with, say, Taiwanese self-identification, willingness to support the government, their desire to want to support the government during a crisis. Those things just keep going up and up.
You're listening to Talking Taiwan with your host, Felicia Lin.
That was Raymond Kuo, director of RAND's Taiwan Policy Initiative. I sat down with Raymond and Catherine Kish, research assistant and Chinese language specialist at RAND, to talk about their War on the Rocks article, Taiwan's Will to Fight Isn't the Problem. Later on in the interview, we also talked about how Taiwan could leverage its diaspora. First of all, for my listeners, can you tell me a little bit about RAND and what RAND's mission is, and then how both of you got involved with the organization?
Sure. RAND was founded in 1948, shortly after World War II. We just had our 75th anniversary 1 or 2 years ago. It stands for Research and Development. That's where you get the name from. And it's an offshoot of McDonnell Douglas, the Air Force contractor. And so at the time, I was thinking like, okay, look, we just fought a major world war. We'd like to not do that again. So we were to get the analysis to figure out what our strategy should be in this new environment. And that's where RAND was born. I think maybe by headcount, it is the largest think tank in the country, national security-oriented think tank in the country. And so we work with a variety of different sponsors. This includes the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Homeland Security, Army, and the Air Force, as well as doing a bunch of work in, say, healthcare and also in economics as well. So it's a pretty diverse organization, but lots of really smart people focused on probably the most challenging questions in our time.
How did you get involved?
I used to be an academic, and I left academia to follow my wife's career. And so when I'm here based in Minneapolis, and I'm trying to figure out the next thing, trying to figure out how to both combine my interest in foreign policy with an academic kind of focus, and also turn more towards focusing on East Asia and specifically Taiwan. And RAND at the time was looking for like experts and greater expertise in those areas. I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted.
How long have you been with them?
4 years now.
Okay. And Catherine?
So I found RAND after college. I've been at RAND for around 1.5 years now. I studied political science and Chinese back in college and was really looking for an opportunity where I could use both of my skills. And I'm half Taiwanese, and when I was graduating, I was really looking for a job where I could do work related to Taiwan and also Chinese defense policy. And RAND, I was lucky enough to be accepted by RAND too. So I'm very happy to be learning and to be mentored by Raymond.
Oh, wonderful. Also, I would like to know if you could tell me a little bit about the Taiwan Policy Initiative, because I saw that you're the inaugural director of RAND's Taiwan Policy Initiative. How long has the policy been around? When was it established? And were you personally involved with setting up the Taiwan Policy Initiative?
It sounds fancier than it is. The way I view the role is that in the United States, we often have a lot of foreign policy discussions that start with us and then project outwards. And my view was that, look, in most of the other countries of the world, like we have a wide variety of partners and allies in and around the world. They all tend to be fairly developed, right? And whether or not they have extremely smart people at their very good universities over there, or they send their people to the United States where they study at our great universities. One way or the other, there are really smart people all around the world. And so my view was, look, we should be learning, at least in terms of the Taiwan space, we should be learning what it is that the Taiwanese are thinking about, and then try to take some of that perspective, verify it, and then input it into our kind of research/policy process. For example, the article that we're going to talk about today is based on a wider RAND project, where the genesis, I think, was conversations I had randomly with people in Taiwan about 3 or 4 years ago, saying like, oh, you guys are really worried about civil defense. That's really interesting. You've got Heizhou and a couple other like organizations, Taiwan. I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. Maybe we should be doing something about this. And from however many years ago, writing proposals to our sponsors who were saying, oh, that's really interesting. We'd like to know more about that. And then having the opportunity to go back to Taiwan and more formally talking with everyone there to say, okay, yeah, here is the breadth of the preparations the Taiwanese government has made. And here is how deeply they've been thinking about these concepts and implementing these concepts over, say, the last 3 years.
when our mutual friend Jason shared your article, Taiwan's will to fight isn't the problem, I thought, yes, this is definitely something that we should talk about. In fact, it actually came up in one of my interviews with Dr. Zheng Cai. He led a medical mission to Ukraine, and he told me in his interview that he had shared these personal conversations and observations that most people in Taiwan really just don't want to fight and go into battle with China. So he was really concerned about this. So this question of Taiwanese people's willingness to fight is really a very interesting question. And for a lot of reasons, I think I want to circle back to that later in this conversation. But before we get into all this, I wonder if you could share, how did you go about doing the research for this article, and what were some of the key indicators and types of data that you sought out, and why?
Sure. So Catherine did a great job in terms of finding the cross-cultural analysis. So not just looking at Taiwan, other countries have dealt with this issue as well. So in the broader report, but that we also referenced within the War on the Rocks article, Catherine, which countries do we do case studies on?
We did, I don't know if all of these made it in, but we looked at Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and then also South Korea, Singapore.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes.
And so trying to find examples from other countries who have pursued this path, and what are the kind of lessons learned, what works, what doesn't work, and what does that tell us for recommendations for Taiwan? The other big component of it was to review the literature on civilian support for defensive operations, civil defense, and how civilians can support these kinds of operations in the literature. And then lastly, I think a pretty big focus of the research was going to Taiwan and talking with the experts there, both Taiwanese and non-Taiwanese, to get a sense of, okay, how long have they been doing this? How effectively have they been doing this? What areas have they done really well in? What areas could they do more about? And so I think one of the major takeaways from the project was that, especially at the central government level, there's been a whole ton of preparation. And you have the central government level with a lot of great planning. But it's also building upon the sort of, I don't know, the substrate, I guess is the word, of just the general public sense of, yeah, we really want to do something. And so in the United States, we often say, people look at Taiwan, look, there are these military exercises. Why are people just going about their regular lives? And our response is like, one, what would you do in that sort of situation? Do you have the preparation, the training, and the leadership to know what to do? And then two, that kind of gives us a better sense of how we should think about the Taiwanese. It's not a cultural or psychological thing where they're just apathetic. No, it's about, okay, do they have a plan? Do they have the organization? Is there a checklist of what they should be preparing for? That is the issue. So it's not about will to fight. It's about the organization and planning implementation.
I just want to clarify, when you're talking about the military exercises, do you mean the ones that are the scheduled, like Hongguang, that kind of thing? Or you're just talking about the general state of the gray zone tactics of China? Okay, yeah, flying into Taiwan's ADIZ and the maritime things. Okay.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Yeah, so Taiwan's been, as we know, under the threat of attack from China for decades, and you could even say like more than a half a century. And as you mentioned, there's definitely that perception that maybe the Taiwanese are either not concerned or they just don't believe it's going to happen, right? And because of that, maybe they're unprepared or unwilling to fight. And I'm personally concerned because I think about the psychological toll that this has and how this could take a toll on people, namely, perhaps they could become a little bit more numb or apathetic or desensitized as a coping mechanism, because realistically you can't be on high alert all the time, and you just can't function like that. But I think that's a little bit of what you addressed in your comments just now, right, Raymond?
Yeah. I want to give Catherine a chance to chime in here as well.
Yes.
But I think one of the main things is that when we think about will to fight, I think the important thing to think about when it comes to Chinese gray zone kind of coercion is that it's by and large backfired. You look at the trend lines with, say, Taiwanese self-identification, willingness to support the government, their desire to want to support the government during a crisis. Those things just keep going up and up. Despite the increasing gray zone, especially military gray zone coercion that the Chinese are executing, it seems like it's producing the exact opposite political results of what the CCP would prefer.
So One of your findings is that support for conscription is higher in Taiwan than it is in South Korea. However, recently there's been some reports in the news that around 100 people have been found to dodge conscription in Taiwan. So what does that tell you? I think even though, from my understanding, it's mostly celebrities and influence who have dodged the draft, but it does expose some issue that it is possible to dodge the draft.
I don't actually have good data on that. This is something that happens in a whole bunch of countries, right? I think BTS in South Korea.
Yes.
Are they going to serve? Because
They just finished serving.
exactly. It's the funniest thing that, my daughters were singing Korean once. I was like, what is that? But you guys like me, Daddy, what does conscription mean? I'm like, oh, okay, I see what's going on. I would say yes, there's always going to be these challenges with any kind of conscription service or duty. But I think it's incumbent upon the Taiwanese government, and literally really any government that's doing this, to make sure that the law is applied evenly and that everyone is doing their duty in serving. I think one of the things that I find most heartening from some of our conversations out in Taiwan is the fact that organizations like the Kuma Academy, for example, they were saying that they get disproportionately higher number of women who are coming in and interested in participating, in part because most men go through conscription, so they feel like they have a lot of skills. It's actually really gratifying for them to see that there is broader based interest. This isn't just a young man thing, but something that's indicative of a wider societal push to kind of get ready for the worst possibilities.
Maybe you can share some of the things that you've found from your article. I believe your article starts from an individual level on a civil society. Like, what are some indicators that you have of how they feel about how they would deal with a possible attack from China?
Yeah. Obviously, we have a lot of public opinion data. One of our colleagues, Austin Wong, used to be at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and still runs the Taiwan National Security Survey. Great methodologist, great survey researcher, finding that consistently, one, that there are solid majorities of Taiwanese want to support the government in some kind of crisis, which is frankly higher than in many other countries. I think the analogous statistic for the UK is somewhere like 20-25%, so it's markedly lower. The US is a bit higher, but still not at the same sort of level that we see in Taiwan. Other sorts of indicators that mentioned the civil defense organizations, groups like Kuma and Forward Alliance, as well as a whole variety of humanitarian organizations that mobilize during disasters. That is just a degree of civil society resilience or robustness that we usually rarely see in other countries. I think about natural disasters here in the United States. Who has the existing network to go in and help is much, much more limited. Granted, the US is much, much bigger. But even, I think, 1 or 2 times ago when I was in Taiwan, like a 300-year-old tree by my parents' place had fallen down, and it was cleared within 2 days, which was just astonishing. There was a tree that fell down from my neighbor over here, and it was there for it fallen into her house, and it was
my
there for
goodness.
2 weeks. There were other trees that caught that tree, but still, this is not great, guys. Minneapolis is considered relatively speedy and effective at that sort of thing, especially tree removal. And then lastly, thinking about, say, the kind of a central government and civil society kind of stitch up that we see with the Whole of Society Resilience Committee, that Taiwan has been thinking about these concepts for the last 2 years of the Tsai administration. Is really charging ahead in this year and a half of the Lai administration in implementing civil defense, as we saw with the Hangwon exercise.
Can you tell us a little bit more about this Whole of Society Resilience Committee? What do you know about this?
Taiwan right now has about a 19.5, I think, or $21.5 billion backlog. So they've paid for all these weapons, and the main constraint right now is the U.S.'s ability to produce them in enough time. Earlier this year, Taiwan received, I think, the last tranche of M1 Abrams tanks. That order was placed in 2019, and there's a lot of work that the United States needs to do to reconstitute its defense industrial base so we can be that arsenal of democracy and supply our allies and partners. And so as a result, the Taiwanese are facing something of a trade-off, right? There are cost issues, absorption capacity issues. Even if the weapons were to appear in Taiwan tomorrow, all magically, it would still take some time to organize the military, to provide the training, and figure out how to use these weapons. And so if you have an increasing defense budget, and Taiwanese do, And then where do you put those extra dollars? Well, one area, despite the fact that there are these constraints to production, one area is civil defense. And so they focus on whole of society resilience. How do you get the entirety of a society to be able to suffer and sustain itself in given the deprivations of a blockade or even a war? God forbid these things actually happen. Do people know where to go? Can they get enough water? Is there enough energy stockpiled that you can sustain social and governmental functions and even reduce the civilian draw so that the military can execute its missions and do its job? And I think you're seeing a push right now with the Lai administration to organize the central government, link together with civil society organizations. And I think the last stitch up, or there are two. One is with the local governments, and then the second is to really integrate the reserves. So since they have that sort of critical stitch up function as well.
Catherine, in doing research for this article, was there anything that you found surprising or interesting that you learned?
I think just the premise of the article too, because I think it was important that we were approaching this article from the stance of debunking that the problem is that the Taiwanese people don't want to fight, because I think that has caused a lot of pressure in DC, and also it's important to be informed from that fact as we go about policymaking in DC and providing recommendations towards Taiwan about its own defense policy. So I didn't have as much background about this going into researching this article with Raymond, and yeah, that would...
Okay. Yeah. So actually, thank you for that. Maybe we could lead into that because, yeah, it's very interesting because Donald Trump has stated that he thinks that Taiwan should raise its defense spending. This often comes up that is Taiwan spending enough on its defense? He's saying that they should raise their defense spending to 10% of its GDP. What do you guys think of that? And can you comment on if you think 10% is too high? And what does Taiwan currently spend on defense, and how much is it planning to increase its spending?
Yeah, that would be difficult for any economy. For context, the only country that is spending more than 10% currently is Ukraine. And in 2024, Israel's estimated defense spending was 8.8% of its GDP, and Russia's was around 7% of its GDP. And all of these are countries that are in active conflicts. The Taiwanese government has historically had a hard time pushing through more aggressive defense policy due to internal political polarization that Raymond and I touched on in the article. But they've actually made massive strides over the past decade under Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te's administrations. So since 2016, Taiwan has already exponentially increased its defense spending. Between then and now, it has increased by 76.8%, I think. And this year, Taiwan has allocated $21 billion towards defense spending, which is a little over 2% of its GDP. And the Taiwanese government recently announced that they want to reach 5% of its GDP for defense spending by 2030. These increases in commitments, I think, demonstrate resolve from Taiwan towards defending their country. But as we touched on in the article, to realize this, Lai's administration will have to get through political polarization to pass the policies through the legislature and also get more public support.
Taiwan, I think, as a percentage of central government budget, spends more on defense than the United States does on federal government spends on the military. So there are a number of constraints here. Even though there's seriousness of purpose, there's a number of constraints. The tax base is just very different in Taiwan. A lot of small and medium enterprises. So if you want to increase the tax rate, you're going to be hurting a lot of people, and nobody likes to see the tax. So that's just a reality, unfortunately. 10%, I need to do the actual calculation, but I think 10% of GDP on the military would be something like 85% of the central government budget.
Oh.
That is enormous. When you think about the amount of the United States, the amount of times take up about, I think, 65% of our budget. That's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, right? If you could imagine taking all of that money plus 20% more and then handing it over to the military, that's the size of the budget we're talking about. It's enormous. This is not to say that Taiwan does not have enormous security challenges. So it absolutely does. I think the bigger questions, at least in my mind, are about the production and absorption capacity issues. That I would love to be in a world where Taiwan has to think about, okay, I have these extra 10 NT. Do I put it towards civil defense or do I put it towards missile? We're just not in that world right now, given the constraints on military production and absorption capacity.
And yeah, before we started this interview, we were chatting a little bit about the whole recall movement that happened. And so I'm curious to know if you could comment a little bit more on the political polarization in Taiwan that has traditionally made this defense spending so hard.
Yeah, so I think part of the issue with polarization, at least in my mind, it's not a. We often think of polarization as a personality thing or a personal thing. For me, it's much more about institutions. Even though you get news cycles of political leaders and rising stars, falling stars, you still see this kind of growing polarization within Taiwan and many different countries. And so for me, that kind of suggests a structural issue, that there is declining confidence in institutions, that institutions themselves are not able to mitigate those polarizing incentives as well as they should. And so part of this, at least in my mind, comes back to the political parties. There's a kind of a joke that I heard a friend of a friend who works in DOD or somewhere says something like, look, there are only two real parties in Taiwan. You've got the DPP and you have the Chinese Communist Party. Goes a little bit too far. I absolutely do not think the KMT or the TPP or any other parties in Taiwan are bought by the CCP.
Really?
Yeah, I think there's a bigger issue, though, that the person I've read about, in that he's saying, like, there are only two real parties. When we think about modern mass parties, coherent ideology, coherent platform, bringing together a wide swath of people, listening to their members and translating that into policy that they will pass in the legislature based on, or they'll negotiate with other parties in order to pass in the legislature. The DPP is one of the few parties, or maybe the only party in Taiwan, that really has a modern mass character. The TPP we'll see how they do in next year's local elections. At least in my mind, they're very much a populist party based around Cohen's. And so when he's not on the ballot, things tend to go a little bit awry. The KMT strikes me as much more like 19th century Chicago-style machine party. It's about, give me your votes and I'll take all the money and spend it on you. And there's a limit to how far you can do that in a national election, right? Because you can't say, we'll take the national treasury or a budget or whatever and spend it on a minority of districts. That just won't work. And so because of these institutional party weaknesses, you have incentives towards polarization, working on obstructionism as opposed to working with the ruling party, waiting for the next round of the fights, delegitimizing the other parties. This is not great, and it suggests, at least in my mind, an institutional weakness in Taiwan that really needs to be solved/strengthened in order to address the polarization and get to higher defense budgets.
I also think it's interesting for me when I think about this idea of civil preparedness, and you also talked about this in the article, is that if we think about the civil preparedness in Taiwan and in the U.S., because we're here in the U.S., it's interesting to think about how Taiwan and the U.S. handled COVID, right? But of course, there's a lot of different factors: the compliance of the society, the communication, trust between the society and government. But what were your comments in terms of how prepared the U.S. is for civil preparedness in terms of either disaster or defense?
I think the erosion of trust in institutions is a really big issue in the United States, especially when it comes to issues of public health. Beliefs about COVID conspiracy theories. The term is plandemic, which I hate, but there it is. It's evocative. There are real issues here. The extent to which the United States is prepared for, let's say, a future disaster or pandemic. I'm not a homeland security expert. I imagine there are going to be significant challenges going forward, given the cuts that we've seen in the federal government budget and the kind of the specific departments that have been cut. But you'd have to ask like an actual either public health expert or like a disaster response expert. Yeah, that unfortunately is not me. Okay.
If you're looking at Taiwan and what is Taiwan doing, you can't help but then look back upon yourselves and look at what, by comparison, is the U.S.'s preparedness on this level too, right?
Yeah. Catherine and I were in D.C. together a number of weeks ago, and we're speaking with some people in one of the rocks, and I was saying that one story that came out was that we were sitting in the Pentagon and discussing Taiwanese civil defense, and the guy there was like, look, senior leaders, look, I actually don't know if the bombs fell in D.C. tomorrow. I don't know what I would be doing in that sort of situation. We're sitting in the Pentagon, like, you would come here, right? Like, you would be coming here because this is the nerve center of our preparedness, and you can help out and provide that support. I sit here in Minneapolis. I certainly don't know what I will be doing. I'd probably go to the nearby reserve center and ask if they need any help, but I'm also sure that they'd be like, who is this random dude and why is he here? You had gotten, like, I think, specific information on, like, when was the last time we in the United States had done from, like,
Yeah. So I think the last time the United States had an official department or institution federally in charge of civil defense was during the Cold War. So since then, that has been dissolved, and we don't have anything like the Whole of Society Resilience Committee in Taiwan that's like a national coordinating institution that brings together different actors to talk about civil defense and coordinate civil defense policy. So in the United States, civil defense and emergency reaction is oftentimes very decentralized across private, local, state, and federal government actors. Yeah, so definitely handled very differently here.
I don't want to get to some things that you guys can't comment on, but I was also thinking about how there's been a rise in the espionage cases in Taiwan involving China. And what do you think is the impact of these cases that this might also have on civil society and, again, the will to fight?
I can't comment on any specific espionage cases. I will say, though, that one difference between the United States and Taiwan is that Taiwan doesn't really have a coherent clearance system. When you think about the United States, like, I have secret clearance or top secret clearance or that kind of thing, Taiwan doesn't really have that, which actually inhibits the sharing of sensitive information. So when we talked with civil society organizations in Taiwan, one of the main issues was that even though they wanted to work more closely with the central government, some of the things that the central government would ask for, they were extremely reticent to provide. For example, membership rolls. I could hand this membership roll over to you, but would that mean that it would just go straight to the Chinese government? And now, what was supposed to be a coordinating function or a piece of information has now become a target list for the PLA if they ever decide to invade. Taiwan suffers cyber attacks all the time. I think it was it last year they had the something hack where people in China were calling up people who had bought different types of books in Taiwan and pretended to be from the local neighborhood. So if it gets down to that degree of cyber attack and data collation, there are understandable concerns among civil society actors about wanting to work more closely with the Taiwanese government and vice versa. I would say that while espionage, fifth columns or that kind of thing are really something to be concerned about in Taiwan, if I could make any recommendation, it's that Taiwan's political system, despite the polarization, is still extremely vibrant. And so it's certainly compared to a whole bunch of other countries, very strong political and social institutions. And so it's necessary to embrace that, I think, and remember how strong and resilient those are. For example, during the recall campaign, there were, or I think it was separately, but there were those deportations of Chinese spouses of Taiwanese citizens. Look, to some extent, some people I've talked to, experts said that they thought that was a good thing. For me personally, Taiwan's democracy is strong enough to be able to encompass those sort of negative voices. And I don't know what the Chinese version of this is, but a Streisand effect. The more you complain about something, the more you drive eyeballs and attention to it. And look, I get it. The Lai government cannot speak for every crank that's out there, or like it has to have to deal with every... Look, if somebody gets married to somebody and that person wants to spout off about Taiwan, ultimately, who does it really affect? And the more you push back against it, the more you give it a platform to infect or create these narratives about the weakness of Taiwanese democracy. So on that side, I can't comment on any specific espionage cases, but I think there's a broader public-facing side of things that you need to balance those concerns against.
Yeah, it's a really tough call because the cases that you're talking about, the spouses were actually also social media influencers. So it's not like the average person that's just expressing their opinion that may be criticizing the government or saying something about unifying Taiwan and China. But they have a platform, presumably, and they can amplify these opinions.
It's true, it is. Although I'll just say, look, how much social media do we consume?
Too much.
In terms of social media, I'm more familiar with studies that focus in the United States.
Okay.
Oftentimes, I think the academic literature says that, yes, social media can have an influence, but it's one fairly limited. You're like, okay, maybe because we consume so much of it, it aggregates over time. But no, what they tend to find is that it exacerbates the opinions of people who would be susceptible to it already. So you're really talking about, let's say, 3 to 6% of the population, maybe 7% of the population, that really seizes upon these things. Now, in a country like the United States of 345 million, We're talking millions of people, but on an overall societal level, it's actually fairly limited. And Taiwan's a different society, has much greater degrees of Chinese penetration. But I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, we might see a lot of these narratives, but they don't necessarily translate into practical effects, especially when we go back to thinking about how Chinese gray zone coercion really hasn't done anything to stop the kind of monotonic increase in Taiwan's only self-identification.
Is there anything that you'd like to share from the research on the article that makes the case that the Taiwanese do have the will to fight that we haven't talked about already?
I think and this is anecdotal, but the sheer amount of enthusiasm amongst the Taiwanese public for figuring out what to do in these sorts of situations, I think is something that often gets lost. I mean, most of the civil defense organizations have trainings booked out like 3 months in advance. It's as hard to get into a Michelin star restaurant as it is to get into one of these. That's how popular these things are. I think one foreign representative office held a training for trauma surgeons in Taiwan, saying, look, how many of you have ever seen a gunshot wound? And the answer is like, nobody had. It's like, all right, I deal with one every day, if not multiple ones. So here's what you need to know. And the training for that went around like 3 blocks of like full MDs. So there is just this deep interest in there, which I think the question then is, you have this foundation of public and societal interest. So what do you do with it? How do you harness it in such a way that it can be as effective as possible in a conflict scenario? Different organizations have different perspectives of how to do that. We can discuss that further if you'd like. But at the very least, it is a resource that the Taiwanese can take advantage of, and should be taking advantage of. There's a whole variety of stuff that, especially when we think about the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, there's a strong tradition of civil defense and civil society organizations that organize in different ways. For example, there are interfaces. I can only remember the acronym. I think it was MPK.
Yes.
I might be wrong.
Yes, you did.
That it helps to deconflict missions. So it sets standards for civil defense organizations, acts as an intermediary between those organizations and the central government. There are definitely initiatives like that. Some of these countries have a tradition of hunting that can help out as well. Firearms ownership is obviously extremely low in Taiwan, and I don't think that's probably a good thing. But that sort of martial culture, the hunting culture, the familiarity with firearms and being able to use them is something that can be quite helpful as well. I was thinking about even something like engaging the diaspora. Israel has birthright. We used to have Love Boat. I don't know what it's actually called. It's reaching out to the diaspora for either funding, resources, training, education can be very useful as well. I remember, this is a bit of an aside, but I think a friend of mine was on the very first birthright trip to Israel. And she's extremely, very much a pacifist. And at the time, the Israeli Defense Forces didn't really know what to do with a whole bunch of American teenagers. So they said, let's just toss them into boot camp and see how it goes. So They brought her out, they brought them all out, gave them an N16 and said, here's a firing range. Shoot that thing over there. And she was so scared about accidentally killing something that she held the M16 like incredibly still as like a 3-round burst. And she keyholed all of 9 shots. And they're like, do you want to be a sniper for us? Absolutely not. But you can imagine sort of a similar sort of situation where you're drawing upon the broader international Taiwanese community. That could serve as a source of not just bodies, sadly, also intelligence, information. When we think about Ukraine, right? This is something I say when I talk with, say, Taiwanese American communities, organizations. In the advent of war, one thing that was really helpful was to have translators. I don't mean language translators, although that's helpful. But for the diaspora to say to their home communities, hey, look, this is why where I came from really matters. This is why what you're seeing here is a sign of retranslating not just the words, but also the social, political context. That sort of thing is something that I think the Taiwanese diaspora can read. I would also say that it requires preparation in advance to be engaged with your home communities, your local communities, and be able to speak about X, Y, and Z issues, to put yourself out there. I remember I'm second generation, so my parents were the ones who immigrated here. Catherine, I think you're third, maybe?
I'm first.
Okay, never mind.
Worse. Because I moved here with my parents, yeah.
Okay. I apologize to my elder dad. For my parents' generation, they would disproportionately hang out with other Taiwanese Americans, which makes a lot of sense. But it really is incumbent upon subsequent generations to get out there, leverage, you are integrated into the society at that point. And so how do you put yourself out there so the rest of your communities understand that this is why Taiwan matters?
This is such an interesting conversation, and I think there's a lot of, I don't even know how to address that, but work that could be done with the diaspora, because that is one thing that Taiwan has in its favor, is a diaspora that really cares about Taiwan still. So I think that's something important that could be developed. I don't know whether there's some kind of network or something to be considered there. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I've spoken to FATA.
Yeah, you spoke at their leadership conference this year, right?
Yeah. And one of the things that I was chatting with about people there is that oftentimes I'm here in Minnesota and there are these talks that are put on by the Foreign Policy Association called the Great Decisions. And so people will get up there and they'll speak, and some people will be tasked with, you will speak to us about X, Y, and Z issues. And oftentimes they're just really scared. The people who actually end up speaking are the ones who have an outsized sense of confidence in themselves. And so reducing those hurdles for the diaspora community to say, look, you don't need to go up there and develop a whole set of talking points. You don't need to go up there and have a slide deck already prepared. The more that experts within the diaspora community can actually do that and then disseminate it, right? So that, look, you will have this random person in, Iowa, who's like the only Taiwanese American in 50 miles. But then they receive a set of talking points. They receive a PowerPoint that they are free to edit and do whatever they want to, put their own spin on it. And so then the burden is lifted to the large extent. It's not that you need to do all this preparation. Instead, here's all the preparation that's been done for you. Make this real to your community. Because I cannot tell you what a person sitting in Des Moines is going to actually care about. But that person does. And they can take advantage of the kind of resources that are out there and then say, okay, yeah, the reason why this matters is because Iowa produces a ton of soybeans and a good chunk of that goes straight over to Taiwan to make, I don't know. Yeah. And this is where your product goes. And this is why it matters. Here's why I am here and why I'm part of your community. In my mind, something like that, if we do it on a American, Canadian, or Australian, wherever the diaspora happens to be out there and be able to take something that's already available and then put their own kind of personal twist on it, I think would be helpful.
Thank you for sharing that. Catherine, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think on the international examples piece that we touch on, another example is I think there's a lot of potential for Taiwan to engage kind of technical skills in its civil society and domestic population. So an example that we touch on in the article is Estonia's Cyber Defense League. That's something that I think Taiwan could definitely adopt, like with its tech-savvy population, a lot of potential there.
So there are a lot of independent fact-checking organizations and things like that, but this is a little bit different with the cyber defense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that one's not for fact-checking. So it's part of Estonia's kind of civil defense apparatus. And what they do is more cybersecurity cooperation work, and they serve as a coordinating body between government, nonprofit, and private cybersecurity actors, and brings all of that together. So there's like an organized way of tackling cybersecurity issues.
More than anything else, the bottom line takeaway is that while we in the United States have a general perspective on what people think that Taiwan is doing, it really needs to be informed by better information about what the Taiwanese themselves are doing. I'll see articles in Foreign Affairs or something like that by somebody, and I'm like, you know what? You can very clearly tell that, one, they don't speak the language, so that's an issue. Two, that their information is at least 5 years out of date. That a lot of the recommendations that they're giving is based on a vision of Taiwan that is... Do you know what the Oriental theme is?
No, actually I don't.
You'll...
Oh,
exactly. Yeah. Oftentimes in these kinds of conversations or the articles, I'll read something and I'm like, and that theme will just go through my hair, like of the sense of, okay, this is who the Chinese are as a psychological or cultural thing. This is who the Taiwanese are as a psychological or cultural thing. And I think to circle back to Austin Wong, our colleague, one of the great things about his research, especially his academic research, is that he finds just how contingent, say, even things like Taiwanese will to fight actually is. If the United States clearly commits to Taiwan's defense, that actually increases Taiwanese will to fight by 7%. And 7% doesn't seem like a lot, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we're starting with a will to fight that's quite high already, 66%. On top of that, Taiwan is a fairly old population. I think median age is 60. Oh, sorry. Oh, no, 41. If it's 60, we're really tough. And you're going to hit a ceiling effect. My grandmother will be 100 next year. There is no way she's going to be fighting. And when you get older populations, that's just going to happen. But when you're talking a population where the median age is 41, 42, and still 2/3 of the people say, yeah, if something happens, we're going to go out there and kick some butt or do something to help support, that is really high. And it is conditional and contingent. And I mean that in the best possible way. But the things that we do here in the United States actually have an impact in terms of what the Taiwanese public wants to do, what's possible for the Taiwanese government. And so I think the better our sense in the United States of what the Taiwanese are doing, the better our policy can be to affect what the Taiwanese are doing and supporting them and pushing them in a more positive direction.
Yeah, and I wanted to circle back to the question of why is the will of the people to fight so important? Because obviously we would like to know that the people of Taiwan care and that they would defend themselves. But yeah, you're right that in a way it shows that if they're willing to defend itself, then its strongest allies or other countries in the region would be more on board to help them as well.
The more Taiwan is able to help itself, the more other countries want to help it. And you look at, sadly, Ukraine, right? They've been fighting this war for, it's going on to 3 years now, right? Deterrence failed in Ukraine. Russia invaded. And the Russian military was far less effective than what many people assumed. But I think in part, one, you can't rely upon the incompetence of your adversary. And two, the Ukrainian people came out and fought against them. And they had been able to engage in this long war because even though, I forget what the exact metrics are, but even the latest kind of engagements, for every Ukrainian that dies, like 5, 10, 20 Russian soldiers are dying. There is an asymmetric advantage when you're fighting for your own country, when you're fighting on your home turf. I think maybe one of the most inspiring things for me, there's a phrase by an academic named Charles Tilly, that the state makes war and war makes the state. And you look at like the video of Ukrainian soldiers in the middle of a forest singing their national anthem. That is the state being made right in the midst of the war right there. That's what allows a people to survive. Sorry, no, I'm going on a little long on this, but one of my friends here, Tanisha Fazal, she wrote a book in 2007, 2008 called State Death. And she finds that the biggest predictor of whether or not a state resists attempts to conquer it or resurrects itself after being conquered is its level of international recognition. And to some extent, I wonder whether or not the variable she's using is not a proxy for how many other countries actually recognize you, but how many other countries recognize that you are a coherent identity, which means that you have to start with that coherent identity. That the more that the Taiwanese think of themselves as a cohesive, separate identity, that even if, say, the Chinese were to invade and successfully conquer Taiwan, let's say the worst case scenario happens, at some point, the government weakens, the Chinese government weakens, and that identity just bursts back out. Poland is, I think, the ideal example here. It was literally wiped off the map as a political entity for centuries. And yet, Felicia, I know you're in New York City, so if you go to Central Park, there is a statue there of a Polish general who was essentially like the founder of the country. Not really the founder of the country, but when it came back, he was the one who led it. So that's what I hope and take away, that even as the military balance shifts, as the political machinations happen, that this Taiwanese civil society is extremely strong.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and I think also just as a practical matter, the longer that Taiwan can defend itself and survive and hold out, the better its chances if something like this would happen, and that it could be actually assisted by other neighboring nations or the U.S. or its allies, for sure. Yeah. And I think it's also important to talk about the polarization regarding the civil defense preparedness in Taiwan, because maybe you want to comment about that. I have my thoughts.
Yeah, I think first off on the sustainment question, Taiwan has a lot of strengths going for it. It's effectively self-sufficient with water. For indefinitely, food is, you're not going to get fine cuts of meat, but Taiwan can sustain its population on food. The bigger question has often been energy, especially with the shutdown of the last nuclear reactor. But Taiwan has, I think, a legal mandate to have a minimum of 6 months of coal, 90 days of fuel oil, and about 8 days or more of liquefied natural gas. And so you're like, oh, whoa, LNG is like 40% or more of Taiwan's energy production. The thing is, though, you can convert liquefied natural gas reactors to run on fuel oil. Now, the ability to get that energy supply to the power plant while missiles are falling, really big issue. But at the very least, the stockpile is there, and the Taiwanese have been executing training and planning to get it to that last mile. When it comes to polarization, this is a real issue. The real stitch up is, I think we mentioned earlier, is at the local, the county and city government level. The central government is DPP. Most of the local and city governments are opposition. And so there is a certain reluctance there to want to actually engage in that. And I think this is where the United States actually can have a really big impact. That the U.S. has this outsized ability through its public diplomacy to say, look, we think this is a priority. We want more of this. We want more civil defense. So yes, we understand there's polarization, but you central government and you local governments, you need to get over yourselves and just get this done. And the U.S. has that sort of unique ability to just say, look, this is important, get it done.
And I think in Taiwan, there's also the whole messaging, going back to the whole political polarization in Taiwan, specifically on the issue of supporting civil preparedness and defense and all that. There's different sides. Like one side is we shouldn't be putting our resources on that because this is actually like fanning the flames and it's actually antagonizing China and this is not really serving us. And then there's the other side of that. We need to be prepared because there are gray zone tactics. There is a threat and there is a reason why people should be prepared. In my opinion, maybe it's about normalizing the preparedness and that it's an awareness and it's just a way to empower people, whether it be in a natural disaster or in the case of some military altercation.
My opinion is the same. I think it's about a cultural shift of how people in Taiwan start to look at this issue, which is why I think it's so important that the Lai administration has made whole society resilience front and center in its civil defense strategy. Like even when I was growing up in Taiwan and when I talked to like my parents and my parents' friends who live in Taiwan, people don't talk about this. The news doesn't report about this. I think that's why when I was saying about new things I was learning when I was working on this article with Raymond, I think before I started working on kind of research and policy side of things, I wasn't really thinking about Taiwanese people caring about will to fight because it just wasn't front and center in people's minds. So I personally think it's very important that currently the Taiwanese government is putting this front and center to show that this is a cultural shift that needs to happen for there to be public support for like increasing conscription and then having these civil society grassroots programs to train people to be prepared for any type of disaster crisis events.
I'm very curious, like, if you could comment a little bit more, Catherine, because you said when you were growing up in Taiwan, what age were you there up until, and can you comment a little bit about what it was like for you and what you observed at that time growing up?
I was in Taiwan when I was in kindergarten till 7th grade, like the end of 7th grade. Yeah, so like
significant amount of time. Yeah.
Yeah, it was. So I think it was like in the beginnings of becoming politically aware, but not fully yet because I like left in 8th grade. But yeah, I think my experience like watching the news at home and talking about things with my mom and my family and my friends, like this was during like 2001 till 2000, I think 14 time. So during that time when I lived there, this was definitely not anything that was like discussed day to day.
Well, that's very interesting. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I said that's a very interesting time to look back on that because I was the first DPP president that got elected. So it was very early on. What was it like growing up there? Were you taught about the whole, like, what to do if there's an earthquake or if something should happen? Was that part of the education system?
I think the most that we had in terms of like disaster preparedness was like in elementary school. We would run out to the 操场, like the open athletics area. I don't know how to say that in English. It's like a gym, but outdoors. And like we would gather in like empty spaces. And there were like, I remember being educated on like golden triangle, find angles when they're like when buildings are collapsing so you don't get squashed. But that was like the extent that I had with my public school education in Taiwan in terms of disaster preparedness. So I think definitely in the years after I've left, there's been a massive ramp up in educating people on crisis preparedness. Yeah, I'm curious about your guys' thoughts too, because that was also from like a child's view. Yeah.
I only lived in Taiwan much later as an adult, and it's a very different experience because I'm not that fluent in the language, and I didn't go through the education. I was there from 2001 to about 2007 or 8.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I was there from 2001 till 2003. And
We were all there at the same
Oh,
time.
wow. Is that crazy? The overlap? Wow.
Yeah, wow.
Well, Felicia, to return to your point about polarization in civil defense, I think I'll say something that might be a little bit controversial, but I don't think the opposition parties are wrong in that. Right? They're right. They could these kinds of trainings and ramp ups could actually, they are seen as provocative by the Chinese. And I think it's a legitimate concern on the opposition's party's part of, look, let's say the United States just doesn't show up, right? Let's say nobody comes to our aid. Then we've just poked the Chinese in the eye for no good reason and just made them really pissed off. But I think it's important to interrogate the foundations of the assumptions that underlie that argument, which I think, to their credit, it's really hard to interrogate these assumptions. But the idea that absent the United States, Taiwan can't do anything to defend itself. I think if we look at Ukraine, we're pretty clear that the U.S. was sending Ukraine like weapons that were 20 years old. And they were hammering, just absolutely wrecking the top-of-the-line Russian systems. Look, the Russian Black Fleet is now a subsurface fleet because the Ukrainians blew all their ships up. And so the idea that Taiwan doesn't have the ability to defend itself or can't make it extremely costly for any sort of Chinese invasion, such that the Chinese will be deterred from invading, is an assumption that needs to be interrogated, especially given that the Taiwanese manufacture more anti-ship missiles a year than the United States does. That's not a very high bar, like, at all. But the very fact that's occurring and Taiwan is arming up with those really effective asymmetric defense systems, I think is an important thing for anyone to keep in mind. I think the other question is a certain degree of national interest or maybe national pride. You as a political leader, a Taiwanese political leader, do you think that Taiwan is valuable? Do you think that the history, the culture, especially the political culture, that the democracy that you as a society has inculcated and developed over the last 20, almost 30 years now, do you think that's valuable? If so, do you think it's worth defending? If, let's say that the United States and nobody else comes to Taiwan's aid, are you not in a better, stronger position the stronger that you are for any kind of future negotiation? Especially, I wrote a piece on the Ukraine war about some of these dynamics where a lot of people were saying Ukraine should just give up and try to get a better deal. The way Ukraine gets a better deal is trading its defensive capabilities for that better deal. Because you know what's worse than trying to negotiate when you have a whole bunch of weapons? Trying to negotiate when you don't have any weapons. Xi Jinping would love for it if Taiwan doesn't have any weapons, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that it's a good idea for Taiwan to pursue that approach.
If there's anything that we haven't talked about, or if there's any personal takeaways that you got from working on this particular article or a message that you have from my audience, is people that care about Taiwan, a lot of them are diaspora, but we also found that we do have quite a large listenership in Taiwan, apparently, too.
I'll let Catherine go first, but I will just say that she, I think according to her first song,
Oh, what is this song?
I'm sorry, was I not supposed to say that? Oh, shoot, sorry. I'm going to go on mute while you talk.
Thanks, Raymond. So I'm also a musician and a
wonderful.
singer and a songwriter. So I recently released my first song like on all streaming platforms under my name.
Congratulations.
If anyone wants to take a listen.
Oh, wow. I didn't do my research, apparently. I looked up some things on Raymond, but not on you. My goodness. Shame on me.
Yeah, this is my side gig where I'm currently not making any money, but having a
Oh,
lot of
hey,
fun.
I get that. My co-producer is a musician and he has some things
Oh.
on Spotify and all that. And I understand the struggle. He's a guitarist
Yeah.
and a composer. So yeah, congratulations to you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, it was very exciting.
So do you have a Spotify or something? We can share it. Sure, why not?
Oh,
If you
okay.
want.
Yeah. That would be great. Yeah, the Spotify is just my name, Catherine Kish, and this name of the song is Wendy. Yeah, I wrote this 2 years ago and then spent this past year recording and producing it with my friends.
Oh, wonderful.
Very exciting. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Raymond.
Oh, sorry, my microphone's working. Sorry, I couldn't say anything. No, just that it was great to work with Catherine on this article. I often think that we have, in the foreign policy space, there are just not enough diaspora or native voices in the space. It's just that we need more of it. And it's been wonderful to work with Catherine on this and just be like, okay, this is why I was encouraging her to say more.
For sure. No, it's all right. It's all right.
You don't
Yeah.
have enough.
There's always a first and then you get better.
Elevate voices. And so when the opportunity comes along, it's important to you. And so like for anybody who is like interested in this type of work and foreign policy, that kind of thing, our voices on policy matters are really important. And so if there's anybody out there that wants to engage more on this, so is thinking about this, especially younger people or people of color, feel free to reach out to me. I think we need more of those voices because we're too much of a monolith in our policy discussions right now.
Yeah.
Great.
One thing to add, I think
Yes.
I've been very lucky to find Raymond as a mentor here at RAND. And also, I was reflecting on all the mentors that I've connected with over the past year after moving to GC, and almost all of them are Taiwanese American.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, this was not
great.
done purposefully.
I'd like to know your list. Maybe I could have some other guests.
Yeah. But I think I agree with Raymond. I've felt very lucky to have been uplifted by this community. And also, I'm at the very beginning of my career, but if
Yeah.
anyone also wants to reach out to me, I'm always happy to talk. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank you so much, Felicia.
I've been speaking with Raymond Kuo and Catherine Kish about their War on the Rocks article, Taiwan's Will to Fight Isn't the Problem.